Looking in One's Hand, a lecture on the history of Roma in Britain by Damian Le Bas. Many thanks to everyone listening for attending this talk, and many thanks to ERIAC for inviting me to deliver it. The title of the lecture I was invited to give on the history of Roma in the United Kingdom provides an excellent starting point for this talk. The word Roma was until recently rarely used in Britain. By recently, I mean in the 3 decades that have elapsed since the fall of Soviet communism and the immigration to the UK of significant numbers of Roma people from formerly communist nations. By significant numbers, I mean visible communities that have attracted cultural and political attention, mentions in novels, usage by politicians as a soundbite. Prior 20th century arrivals were small in number and did not attract such attention. In the 2011 census, 58,000 people in the United Kingdom self-identified as Gypsy or Traveller. Studies, including one undertaken by the organisation The Traveller Movement, indicate that this may represent a significant undercount, not least due to the perception that it is unwise to self-identify as a Gypsy or Traveller in official documentation, for reasons of both historical and contemporary harassment. However, it remains interesting to compare this figure with the possible number of Roma people with roots in the former Eastern Bloc who now live in the UK, and the best estimate we have for these numbers is around 200,000. This is based on research carried out by the Sustainable Housing and Urban Studies Unit at Salford University and published in 2013. This survey is quoted by central government, and the results of the research are available on the government website gov.uk. It refers to migrant Roma. This is the real reason the survey interests me, because of what the phrase migrant Roma means and what it does not mean, because of the various perspectives about whom these ideas apply to and whom they do not apply to. I believe that these questions lead naturally onto a discussion of the entire history of Romani people in Britain. For example, see how I've switched from Roma to Romani people and from the UK to Britain. Why have I done this? I've switched to Britain because I'm using it to refer to the British mainland, the island containing the countries England, Scotland and Wales. The United Kingdom is a political term which did not exist until 1707, by which point there had been a Romani community in Britain for over 200 years. Furthermore, the United Kingdom incorporates Northern Ireland, which for the purposes of Romani history is a very different place and which I shall not cover in this talk. I switched from Roma to Romani people because when the term Roma people is used in Britain, there is often an implication that it is a sort of counterpart to the idea of native or indigenous Romani people. This is certainly how most of my Romani relatives think about the issue, though they do not tend to use the terms Roma or Romani. They call themselves travellers, occasionally Romanis, Romanichals, or Gypsy people, and mostly call Roma people with Central or Eastern European connections foreign travellers, the Roms, or sometimes Romanians, due to the mistaken belief that most of them come from Romania. In the Anglo-Romani dialect of Romani travellers, Rom means husband, at least traditionally. There has been a shift here, and it is arguable that its primary meaning is now Romani person with non-British roots. The plural form of Rom, Roma, does not survive in our dialect. How ironic, therefore, that the ancestors of native Romani people who began to arrive in Britain in the late 15th or early 16th century would have likely called themselves Roma, or at least understood and used this word in other contexts, as the retention of the use of Rom to mean husband attests. At any rate, the first documented arrival of a group of Roma people in Britain was in Scotland in 1505 AD. The accounts of the Lord High Treasurer of Scotland observes that the sum of £7 was given to the Egyptianists, by the king's command, to the Egyptians by the king's command. The king in question was James IV, and the Egyptians were a group of Romani people encamped in the city of Stirling. They carried letters purportedly signed by the Pope, which sought to grant them safe passage through Christian lands. At this point, it's interesting to ask ourselves three questions, which I will not attempt to answer here. Were these people Roma migrants? Does the use of this phrase Roma migrants to describe them strike us as odd or anachronistic? If so, why? The first likely mention of Romani people in England comes just under a decade later in a dialogue of Sir Thomas More, Knight, which refers to an Egyptian woman who had been living in Lambeth, London in 1514. More refers to the woman having a talent for palmistry. She could tell who had stolen something simply by looking at the owner's hand. But how could she tell it by the devil? I could never see her use any worse way than looking in on his hand. In modern English, but how could she tell it by the devil? I could never see her use any worse way than looking in one's hand. By 1530, Egyptians had acquired a dubious reputation in England, at least in the eyes of lawmakers. In 1531, during the reign of King Henry VIII, the first Egyptians Act was passed by the English Parliament, expelling the outlandish people calling themselves Egyptians from the kingdom. In this legislation, we have references to a lack of legitimate work, to nomadism, or if not consistent nomadism, then to periodic movement around the country, to deception, to fortune-telling, and to robbery. For the most part, these have remained tenacious and enduring stereotypes of British Romani people, and with the exception of nomadism, they are still frequently presumed to be the case with Roma people from recently immigrant families. It cannot be overlooked that from the late 1520s, England's relationship with the Roman Catholic world rapidly deteriorated. Romani people had only recently arrived on the British mainland, carrying written confirmation of their Catholic allegiance. In 1554, a second Egyptians Act was passed during the reign of Henry's daughter, Mary Tudor. This act amended the previous act and is notable for several reasons. Firstly, it draws a distinction between Egyptians who were born in England or who had entered England by way of Scotland and those who had arrived from abroad. There is thus an emerging notion of native gypsies, though the Act states that gypsies are not English. The Act gives gypsies the choice to assimilate, leave the realm, or face the death penalty. This punishment was rarely enacted, but it was nonetheless a real threat. Like the first Egyptians Act, this act refers to people calling themselves Egyptians, an indicator that the authorities felt this description could not always be trusted. Two further Egyptians Acts were brought into force in the reign of Mary's sister Elizabeth I in 1563 and 1598. These made references to vagabonds, and the later of the two to rogues and sturdy beggars. There is a clear association of gypsies with untrustworthiness and begging without a moral reason for doing so, begging as a livelihood. There is also reference in the 1598 Act to people wandering and pretending themselves to be Egyptians, or wandering in the habit, form, or attire of counterfeit Egyptians. So here we have apparently two layers of dishonesty: the original false claim of Romani people to be Egyptians, and a subsequent false claim of other people to be Romani. In combination, these two have led to an enduring association of gypsy identity with the pretense of an ethnicity. Gypsies are not just likely to deceive you or steal your property, their identity itself is likely to be a deception. By 1615, i.e. within 100 years of the first reference to Egyptians in England, there is evidence in documents from southern England, the so-called Winchester Confessions, that at least some people were using Romani words in English sentences. This is a possible indicator of several things: either a high level of Romani influence on certain parts of society, or a high level of Romani assimilation into British society, or both. It should be noted that this way of using Romani vocabulary did not supplant the use of the inflected Romani language for at least 300 years. We shall return to that in due course. The last recorded executions of people for being Egyptians seem to have taken place in 1628, according to David Cressy. In Matthew Hale's The History of the Pleas of the Crown, it is stated that about 13 gypsies were condemned and hanged in an episode that took place in the county of Suffolk. In that same year, 1628, John Bunyan was born. He would go on to write the Christian allegorical work, The Pilgrims Progress, regarded as a significant text in the English literary canon. Bunyan's father was a travelling tinker, meaning he went from houses to house, mending small metal articles, but had come to own property, unlike most Romani people and other ethnic travellers who lived in tents made from bent saplings with canvas stretched over the top, variously known as bender tents, bow tents and rod tents. It is possible that Bunyan was of Romani heritage. In 1882, the historian James Simpson put forth arguments that this was the case. I do not mention Bunyan because he was a gypsy who achieved something special. Rather, the juxtaposition of Bunyan with the execution of the Suffolk 13 is an interesting one on a thematic level in terms of how society has reacted to different ways of being a gypsy. On the one hand, we have a writer of an acknowledged masterpiece whose family's acquisition of property, or more specifically land, seems to interact with his atypical accomplishments to make a gypsy or traveller ethnicity appear unpalatable to some. On the other hand, we have those whose gypsiness is less ambiguous, being subject to the direct brutality of the authorities. The severity of the punishments has obviously decreased, but this remains a common division in the way that ethnic Romani travellers are treated in modern Britain. One is either a gypsy menace and therefore to be condemned, or a successful person and therefore not really a gypsy, or at least no longer one. In the subsequent centuries, two new views of the gypsies would emerge, that of the useful agricultural worker and that of the romantic nomad, an alluring wanderer who is close to nature, a domestic noble savage. In the attempt to form a picture of Romani history in the 17th and 18th centuries, we are largely dependent on evidence pieced together from court documents, birth and death registers, and parish records, the archives of local happenings preserved by the smallest units of government. Was there such a thing as typical Romani life in this arbitrarily defined period? Do we really mean the most visible, obvious gypsy life, with the word gypsy representing the general societal view of Romani people as nomads living apart from everyone else? Often groups of Romani people were small enough to escape broad cultural acknowledgement. What are seen as many traditional gypsy jobs became common in this period, notably that of the seasonal agricultural worker travelling between a repeat circuit of farms. In court proceedings, gypsies are often associated with theft. Of course, these are court proceedings, so any Romani people not accused of committing crimes will not be referred to in them. This is an obvious inherent problem with the focus on such records. By the end of the 18th century, there was likely a permanent Romani population in Wales, which was to develop a sense of separateness from English Romani culture. Most families trace their lineage at least partly to a figure called Abram Wood, a harpist whose lifespan roughly coincides with the 18th century. He may be an historical or semi-legendary figure, partly due to geographical separation and perhaps reduced outmarriage. Welsh Romani culture demonstrated remarkable retention of the Romani language, and a conservative dialect with full Indic grammatical inflection, highly influenced by Welsh, was still spoken there by the early to mid-20th century. C.F. Sampson, 1926. Many spoke Romani, Welsh and English. Trilingualism was common, as was possibly the case among Britain's first Romani populations, and as is the case with many Roma in Britain today. In England, by contrast, the use of inflected Romani had become rare by the end of the 19th century, and a mixed language with largely English grammar had become the in-group speech of English Romani people. Anglo-Romani, or Poggedy Jib, the broken tongue. These names are popular with academics, but are in fact rarely used by speakers of the language, who tend to call it Romani, Romanes, the Romani language, the traveller's language, the old tongue, or other names. Due to the overlap between these surviving forms of grammatically conservative British Romani with the constant, initially occasional immigration of Romani families from continental Europe, including families of Greek and Russian origin arriving in the first half of the 20th century, It can be said with near certainty that there has been a constant presence of speakers of inflected Romani in Britain since the end of the 15th century until the present day. Of course, the late 20th and early 21st centuries have also seen a large, sustained influx of Romani speakers, the largest in the history of Britain, as well as to the island of Ireland. By the early 19th century, the romanticisation of the Gypsy by artists is underway, as evidenced by painting and literature. Though there is typically a strong association with the rural wilds, portrayals differ. In Walter Scott's novel Guy Mannering, the character of the charismatic gypsy woman Meg Merrilies is not presented as simply Romani, but in many ways, including her language and clothing, reflects an older stratum of Scottish culture. It could be argued that this was perceptive. Romani and other travellers have often preserved folk traditions, especially in song, long after they have been forgotten by the majority population. It is possible that she was based on a real historical figure, Jean Gordon. 1847 saw the publication of Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, published initially under the pen name Ellis Bell. Regarded as one of the greatest English novels, it has a complex narrative structure and presents the character of Heathcliff, a dark-skinned gypsy in aspect, in dress and manners a gentleman, as an anti-hero who is prone to sadism, fits of rage, and calculated acts of revenge, redeemed largely, if at all, by his love for Catherine Earnshaw, the daughter of his foster father. Heathcliff was found as a child in the streets of Liverpool, and his brutal actions are at least partly explained by his treatment at the hands of the Earnshaw family. In the mid-19th century, the much romanticised horse-drawn wagon finally arrives. Romani people had lived in Britain for 3.5 centuries before they acquired perhaps the most potent cultural symbol of their existence. Initially a bender tent fixed to the top of a generic flat cart, these developed over the next 100 years into a range of elaborate kinds of custom-made living quarters, built and decorated by both Romani and non-Romani families. For instance, the brush wagon had a fully wooden construction and a system of metal rails on the outside to hold the brushes and baskets its owners sold for a living. The wagon time perhaps represents a high watermark in the peaceful continuity of Romani life in Britain. Certainly many Romani families had settled into regular work patterns and were an essential part of the rural economy, and were thus tolerated and even embraced. It is arguable, however, that the wagon as a symbol helped to entrench an unbalanced image of Romani people as essentially nomadic and rural, which has led to a cultural disregard for urban and integrated Romani people, in spite of their obvious presence in city life, evidenced by the number of Romani words found in the urban dialects of cities like Glasgow and London. During the wagon time, many British Romani people emigrated abroad, and new images of Romani people also became commonplace. In this period, their association with horse fairs like Appleby and Stow-on-the-Wold became entrenched, and due to provisions for gypsies to camp in the environs, their attendance at famous horse racing meetings like the Epsom Derby was noted and later painted by artists such as Sir Alfred Munnings and Dame Laura Knight. The association of gypsies with pugilism also developed. From attending boxing booths at rural fairgrounds, British Romani people alongside Irish travellers became major contributors to the worlds of amateur and later professional boxing, hence the emergence in recent years of several world champions. Service in the military was, of course, common for Romani people during both world wars. Conscription was difficult to avoid, in spite of a stereotype that gypsies fled to Ireland to avoid military service. During the First World War, Jack Cunningham, for instance, was awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honour. Several members of my own family fought in the Second World War, and others undertook civilian support roles. In 1926, the modernist writer D.H. Lawrence wrote The Virgin and the Gypsy. In it, Lawrence toys with Romani stereotypes before finally demolishing the perception that gypsies should be treated as strange ahistorical figures, by revealing first that its gypsy character had served with the artillery teams in the Major's own regiment, specifically with the horses back of Arras, as he says himself, and then at the end of the story that his name is Joe Boswell, a typical Romani surname in England with an unspectacular, realistic accompanying first name. And only then she realised that he had a name, the piece concludes. Perhaps most importantly, the name is revealed in a letter written by Joe Boswell himself, challenging the notion that all Romani people were illiterate. By this point, Romani identity in Britain had become synonymous with the idea of the traveller. Traveller was now the self-appellation of most British people of Romani descent. There may have been several reasons for this. The word gypsy was clearly associated by law enforcement with the old stereotypes of trickery and theft. It may have been expedient to avoid using it when talking to outsiders. It may also have been seen, partly for these reasons, as an insult, though there is scant evidence for this. In any case, there were several consequences to traveller becoming the main self-ascription. Firstly, because traveller sounds like a lifestyle descriptor, Romani culture became synonymous with travelling in the public mind, such that Romani people who ceased travelling might be seen as not authentically Romani. Secondly, there was to be public confusion, and often Romani anger, about the ambiguity of whether traveller should mean Romani person or have a wider range of meaning. The fact that any English-speaking nomadic group is likely to refer to themselves as travellers, as is anyone who is not a nomad but who frequently travels, compounds these issues. In private conversation between British Romani people, traveller remains the main self-appellation, but when talking to non-travellers who are likely to conflate nomadic groups, it is more likely that Gypsy or Romani will be used. For some decades, certainly well into the 1960s, the old technology of nomadism was used alongside the new, and encampments contained a mixture of wagons and expensive new trailers. At modern horse fairs, this juxtaposition still exists, but the horse-drawn wagons and to a lesser extent tents are kept as cultural mementos and rarely, if ever, lived in permanently. The acquisition of new vehicles and trailers that could be towed on main roads led to an emergence from rural anonymity and into new mobile trades. Common examples are scrap metal, building and roofing, tarmacking, asphalt, block paving, tree surgery, market trading and vehicle dealing. These developments also led to wider public concern about who these travellers were. Were they real Romani gypsies and hence less frightening, or a new breed of problematic, violent travellers? The growing awareness of gypsy culture as self-reliant, highly and rapidly mobile and capable of physical self-defence led to a new stereotype of the tough criminal who is not to be messed with, thoroughly evident in cinema and television portrayals. In the second half of the 20th century and continuing today, Pentecostal Christianity has exerted a growing influence on Romani traveller and Scottish and Irish traveller culture in Britain. Originating in France with the Vie et Lumière Church, the movement credits itself with the rehabilitation of travellers from a resemblance to negative stereotypes and condemns traditional practices like fortune-telling as immoral. Other aspects of culture, such as boxing and horse fairs, are tolerated, and some, such as study of Romanesque, are encouraged. This latter fact in particular has led to linguistic exchange between British Romani people and Roma speakers of other dialects, in particular the Calderash dialect. The 20th century also saw new legislation in response to concerns about gypsies, which for the purposes of many British laws does not mean Romani people, but anyone of a nomadic habit of life or employment, hence the lack of an initial capital letter. Briefly, the Caravan Sites Control of Development Act of 1960 made it necessary to have a licence to operate a caravan site, making it very difficult for informal encampments to exist. The Caravan Sites Act of 1968 placed a legal requirement on local authorities to provide some sites for gypsies. The Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994 introduced new police powers to move nomads on. The process continues. These laws are likely to soon be followed by a new Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act that will render trespass with intent to reside a criminal offence, meaning that for the first time, gypsies and travellers of any heritage could be imprisoned and have their vehicles confiscated for being on land they do not own. It is a brutal piece of legislation. The publication of Angus Fraser's The Gypsies in 1995 was supposed to mark a consensus of sorts on Romani history, but since its publication, its view has been challenged on various fronts, notwithstanding the fact that Fraser intelligently made room for a wide breadth of understandings of the possible perspectives on whom exactly Gypsies were and are, and the ethics around the construction of our history. Some subsequent writers have disputed the focus on an Indian ethno-linguistic heritage of British Romani people. Some argue that ethnic models based on heritage and descent have a far-right political analogue in the fascist politics of race. It must be observed that the belief in descent, in blood and in language as markers of Romani identity are important aspects of Romani culture which has itself been subject to attempts at extermination. These issues are now widely explored by a growing number of Romani artists, writers, academics and activists, many of whom interact with an international community of Romani peers. This, together with factors like widespread internet use, a slow but clear growth in school attendance and educational attainment, and the aforementioned emergence of Romani Pentecostalism, has led to a pluralism of possible and living perspectives on Romani culture not previously seen in Britain. The 21st century sees an unprecedented complexity of Romani demographics and presence in Britain, which returns us to the beginning of this talk. This lecture is titled Looking in One's Hand. I chose this phrase for several reasons. It refers to the first reference to a Romani person in England and the resultant stereotype, howbeit fortune-telling was and is a traditional job of some British Romani people, versus the condemnation of both the stereotype and the job by Pentecostal groups. It refers to the inability of Britain to look in its own hand and see the contribution travellers have made to its culture, economy, demography and armed forces. It refers to the tendency of some artists, not to mention journalists and politicians, to look no further than their own hand when portraying Romani people, which has led to some one-sided portrayals alongside some subtle and intelligent ones. Thank you for listening.